Okay, so this is kind of part two of the video lecture for the unit on Judaism and anti-Semitism in the religion, race, and ethnicity class. And in this lecture, or part of the lecture, I'll be focusing on the history of anti-Semitism and its Christian origins, and the way that it builds up towards the Holocaust, building on the account in the chapter from Daniel Goldhagen's book, which is assigned to you. The book is called Hitler's Willing Executioners, and you have a chapter that's about the history of anti-Semitism that you'll be reading for this unit. And the object here is to provide context for our highlighted case study in this unit of the course, namely Elie Wiesel's Night, which provides his novelistic and memoiristic account of his experience as a boy in the Holocaust. So this is all designed to provide context for your reading and encounter with that particular text. And obviously, at the heart of all this, we are talking about the very real implications of configurations of race and ethnicity in relation to religion. And the Holocaust provides us with a tragic case in point in thinking about the intersection of these issues. So let's first try to trace some of the origins of anti-Semitism. And of course, anti-Semitism is unfortunately still with us. And unfortunately, these very ancient foundations that I'm about to talk about are also still with us. And we find them lurking around in anti-Semitic tropes that are still with us in 21st century America, in anti-Semitic rhetoric and anti-Semitic thinking, and anti-Semitic thinking that has at times translated into very real, very damaging behavior in recent years. So tracing anti-Semitism back to its origins, we have to think about Christianity as a driving factor of anti-Semitism. I'm not suggesting that there's not anti-Semitism in non-Christian context, or there wasn't something like anti-Semitism before Christianity came on the scene historically. But the historical truth is that Christianity has played a major role in generating bias, discrimination, negative stereotyping towards the Jewish community and towards Jewish people. If we think back to Christian origins and the New Testament text in particular, there's an important part of this narrative that we have to recall, namely the fact that Jesus himself is Jewish, but that Jesus himself is in constant competition with other rivals within the Jewish community, other authorities within the Jewish community, which already sets up a kind of tension between Jesus's Jewishness and the other forms of Judaism that were prevalent during his time. But most importantly, eventually, when it comes down to it, it is the factions of the Jewish population, or the Jewish population itself, broadly characterized as the Jews in the gospel according to John, who are the ones who ask for and instigate Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor at the time, to ultimately crucify Jesus. Their role in this whole narrative, this whole Jesus myth, if you want to call it that, is it shifts and changes depending on which gospel you read. But generally, what you can see is a gradual increase in implicating Jews in general in the death of Jesus. Historically speaking, it's fairly unlikely that a Roman governor would pay much attention to a mob when it comes to performing executions, and that's exactly what this was. And it was probably a political execution given the mode of punishment that was used for Jesus, namely crucifixion. But this is the way that the story in early Christianity, how it firmed up. and it stuck, and the label stuck. The label stuck to Jews, to the Jewish population, and all Jewish people were swept up in this kind of collective guilt around the death of Christ. Now, of course, in a broader theological sense, Jews just simply, from the get-go, refused to acknowledge Jesus as the Messiah or Jesus as the Son of God, or any of those kinds of labels. From that perspective, Jesus was indeed a Jewish individual who either himself misinterpreted himself or was later interpreted by others. Now, of course, all of that flies directly in the face of Christian belief and ultimately church doctrine. And so theologically, that is, of course, problematic in and of itself. So those are in many ways the origins, they're religious, of anti-Semitism in the West. They're really well demonstrated by St. Augustine, who's obviously one of the most influential church fathers from the early history of Christianity in the 4th and 5th century of the Common Era. And in one of his texts, he declares, "You killed Christ about Jews, you killed Christ in your ancestors." Then he quotes another place in the Bible, "Slay them not, lest my people forget." So don't eliminate Jews from the world because they serve as a kind of reminder of the truth and a witness to the truth. So they murdered Christ, according to this Christian conception, but you can't kill them because they stand as a kind of testament to the truth. And of course, if they're willing to convert and accept Jesus Christ and his identity, then of course that's all the better, right? From a Christian perspective. So what is the kind of result or conclusion that Augustine draws in terms of the way that Jewish population should be dealt with in Christian dominated countries and nations? Augustine says, scatter them by your power and bring them down. Make them lowly. Make them in some sense pay. So you can't kill them. They're part of the Christian narrative. I mean, the Torah, right, the Hebrew Bible is the Christian Old Testament. And so Jews obviously play a major role in the build-up to Christianity. Jesus himself was Jewish. So you can't just eliminate them from the picture. But those Jews who are witness to Christianity and know about Christianity, that is, real Jewish communities in history, are certainly subject to negative treatment, according to Augustine. Scatter them by your power and bring them down, right? All of this is captured in the Goldhagen reading, so you can read more detail there. So as you know, Christian Europe, kind of moves through the centuries, and we get up to the medieval period. These ideas from Augustine really manifest themselves in a whole variety of ways. The Jewish population in Europe and in Muslim lands was always a minority other community, and thus a vulnerable community. And of course, there's these stigmas that are attached to them, these religious stigmas that are attached to them theologically and in terms of history when it comes to the Christ killer designation. So they were subject to multiple forms of persecution and violence throughout the Middle Ages. They were confined to ghettos and medieval cities, and this is where we get the word ghetto. When the Black Plague occurred and recurred throughout the Middle Ages, Jews were often blamed for it. They were blamed for transmitting it or inventing it and spreading it among Christian populations. When the Inquisition happened, beginning in the 13th century, the Inquisition, the effort on the part of the church to purge heretical influences that came from the outside and from the inside, resulted in persecution of both Muslims and Jews were offered the opportunity to either convert to Christianity or leave their communities or die. And often they did convert, often they did leave. Sometimes they converted on the outwardly, but they secretly maintained their Jewish traditions. And this kind of thing went on for centuries. They were constantly subject to being scattered, as Augustine put it, through expulsion. And one example is, we all know what happened in 1492, the beginning of a genocide when Columbus sailed the oceans blue, but also in 1492, the Jewish population was expelled completely from Spain by exactly the same leaders who sent Christopher Columbus on his journey, to be dispersed. The Jews were dispersed throughout the Mediterranean and North Africa in particular. So this is a very long negative history leading up to the modern period. So just to sum up, the traditional theological view is that Jews are part of the Christian narrative, but there's a binary. From a Christian perspective, if they're right, then we're wrong. And that is obviously unacceptable for dogmatic Christians, and most Christians throughout history were dogmatic. So the answer is they should disappear, but not through genocide and elimination, but by conversion. They should be converted. And if they don't convert, because of their somewhat special status, they are allowed to persist and exist, but they're subject to punishment. They're subject to bad treatment. And they should be kept around as witnesses to the ultimate truth of Christianity. But then ultimately, because they don't convert, they're subject to eternal damnation, which is God's punishment. And in a sense, there's some, I guess, theological humility in this. That's God's place. The punishment is ultimately meted out by God, and God makes the ultimate determination on what to do with the so-called chosen people. The modern period marks a shift, and this relates very closely to our themes in the course. In modernity, the religious impulses, the theological impulses recede in influence as the secular becomes much more important, the non-religious foundations of society. So one would think that maybe anti-Semitism would go away, but it actually just transmutes into perhaps an even more dangerous form. I think that's represented quite well by this piece of Nazi propaganda that you can see here on the screen. And on the right, you have a depiction of a priest who is offering blessing to an individual, a Jewish individual, who is engaging in conversion to the church. And obviously, the Jewish individual is caricatured in terms of the features, right? Particularly the nose. And so that's not surprising from Nazi propaganda. But this Jewish individual is not dressed in traditional garb. This individual is dressed in secular clothing. By all appearances, a secular citizen of, say, Germany, and there were many Jewish citizens of Germany who were very patriotic, fought in World War I for Germany, and so were pretty much average assimilated citizens, except for their Jewish heritage and identity. This individual has decided to go so far as to convert to Christianity in this depiction, but you'll notice what this individual is hiding behind his back, and it is the Star of David. So what we have here is a Jewish man converting to Christianity, but secretly holding back his Jewish identity, which in the understanding of modernity, really Jews can't ultimately relinquish. They can never give up this identity which has become naturalized. All of this is reinforced on the left hand of this page. I know you probably can't see it. These are cards, actually, cards representing conversions. And the people here have obviously Jewish names. So it's a commentary on conversion and the authenticity of conversion, but also says something about the way that Jews were thought about in Europe and the United States in the 19th and 20th centuries. So just to step back for a moment, we can ask the question why the Holocaust is just so strange, ironic, and tragic beyond the obvious cruelty which we are going to read about and the sheer carnage and the number of people who died in these events. From a cultural historical standpoint, why is this so horribly ironic? What happened? Well, I mentioned before that with the Enlightenment and modernity and the kind of decrease in the influence of church and religion in European society, ideas like religious toleration and equality and the authority of the state, the secular state over the church, the attack on religious myths like the Christ killer myth as superstition, the flowering of culture in the 19th century. With all of that, one might expect that the situation for Jews would get much better. And it's during certain periods of time it did, as Jews were freed by declarations of religious toleration, like in the American Constitution, which declares that all religious expression will be tolerated and no religion will be instituted by the state. Those kinds of impulses suggest that things are going to get better for the Jewish people. All of these things suggest potentially that things will change, that this long period, this long history of persecution is now going to be over. But modernity has another side to it, as it turns out, and this becomes absolutely crucial. There's the technology. Now, technology, of course, is a blessing in so many ways in making life easier, but it also makes it easier to perpetrate war, and it makes weapons of war much more effective. And ultimately, when it comes to the Jewish population, the industrial state has a major impact on the Holocaust, because once the Holocaust gets going, it really becomes, concentration camps really become factories of death, enabled by industrialization and technology. The secular state, which promised to protect people and protect people's freedom and equality and all those kinds of lovely values, morphed into nationalism, and nationalism in certain ways, in terms of fanaticism and devotion, replaced some of the kind of religious impulses of earlier days. And in fact, the state power gets concentrated in the state, in the nation state, and we now start to see the emergence of totalitarian and fascist regimes where individuals concentrate all the power in themselves and the power of the nation in themselves. So we get figures like Mussolini and Hitler, obviously, who arrive on the scene and have absolute police state power. And they're free to institute whatever ideology they want to because of the fervency of their following. The emergence of racialist science is very important. We've touched upon this in the opening discussion in this class. Race is very much constructed during the 19th century in the way we understand it as a kind of naturalized phenomenon. So racialist science in quote-unquote science, pseudoscience in the 19th century invents orders of human beings that are based upon their biological and physiological characteristics that they pass on and share. So human beings are ordered, collected into those racial categories, which are really refined during the 19th century. The interesting thing that happens here is, and the tragic thing is that Jews are wrapped up in this. Jews become a race among other races, which, as we know by now, is a very controversial and problematic thing to do. The way that identity is constructed in terms of Jewishness is very complicated. It's a complicated mix of background, ethnicity, religion, language, etc. And to categorize Jews in general as a naturalized category like a race is really a stretch, but that's why they call it pseudoscience. Jews were positioned as a race. So that depiction of the individual who's converting, who can't get rid of Jewish identity, that's the result of this kind of racialist pseudoscience, right? Positioning people as naturally bound to whatever their racial identity is, and whatever characteristics are related to that. Once you create that sort of typology of human beings, it's very easy to then turn it on its head and turn it into a hierarchy, with obviously, because we're talking about Europe, northern white Europeans at the top of the ladder, and Slavs, Southern Europeans, obviously Asian people, Middle Eastern people, Jews, Black people, running down the spectrum in a hierarchy in terms of the quality and superiority versus the inferiority of different racial groups. Jews were swept up in all of that kind of pernicious thinking, and that had very fateful results. Again, Goldhagen talks about these ideas in his text, and you can see his account there. So, not to simplify things, but if we put some of these pieces together, the rise of the nation state, particularly the fascist nation state or the totalitarian nation state, and that's Nazi Germany. The technology, the ability to kill mass numbers of people at one time simultaneously. This race idea attached to Jews, right? This combined with the deeply ingrained history of anti-Semitism, which positions Jews as a harmful other, an enemy of the people, right? All of these are the ingredients that lead us to what Goldhagen calls eliminationist anti-Semitism, as opposed to theological anti-Semitism, which wasn't necessarily eliminationist, as we saw, right? Remember Augustine? Slay them not, lest we forget, right? But keep them lowly, right? That was theological anti-Semitism. This is the eliminationist anti-Semitism, which, according to Goldhagen, naturally tended towards exterminationist anti-Semitism. You can eliminate this population in a number of different ways: by expelling them, by sending them somewhere else, or by getting them to try to convert or assimilate into society. But the way that this turned out in German society in particular was ultimately you couldn't get rid of your Jewish race. So all Jews were considered to be harmful regardless of their behavior. And so it was necessary to engage in exterminationist anti-Semitism, and the Holocaust is the example of that. Just very briefly, in terms of the events that lead up to the Holocaust, and these events parallel with things that you see in Elie Wiesel's account in Night. Hitler is in charge in 1933. Hitler rapidly starts militarizing Germany with the clear aim of conquest, world conquest, and also he starts instituting his anti-Semitic ideas about the purity of the German people and how other peoples, particularly the Jews, are enemies, a disease, of some kind, or a pest to be eliminated. The Nuremberg laws are part of this story. They're instituted in 1935, and they place severe restrictions on the rights of German Jews to own businesses, to have certain positions in government, restricting their possibilities in terms of careers and finances, obviously intermingling with Germans sexually or in marriage. That is severely restricted by the Nuremberg laws. Jews are basically transformed into second-class citizens. And as I mentioned before, they were very much, if not first-class citizens, very real citizens up to this point in Germany. But things changed rapidly in the 20s and the 30s for them. In 1938, it's a sign of things to come with Kristallnacht, which is a nationwide pogrom or systematic attack against Jews and Jewish property all across Germany. In 1939, Hitler invades Poland. The war begins, and Hitler now starts capturing huge numbers of Jewish people. And initially, the project is to establish ghettos in various cities across Eastern Europe. In particular, that is reinstituting this medieval idea of cordoning off part of town and placing the Jewish population there. In the early part of the war, particularly on the Eastern Front in Poland, and as Nazi Germany moves through the Baltic states and into Russia, the captured territory is really kind of a free fire zone, right, for German soldiers, and special groups called the Einsatzgruppen, who are basically killing squads who fan out across conquered territory and just engage in mass shooting, mass killing of Jewish communities and Jewish populations. And you'll see at the beginning of night, Moshe the Beadle has seemingly gone through one of these mass shootings and has escaped, but completely changed, obviously, by his experience. The Germans kept trying to improvise and devise better ways of killing Jewish populations. They used gas trucks, for example, for some time. Using bullets in firing lines was costly in terms of ammunition. And it was obviously the ammunition was needed, particularly as Hitler expanded all of these fronts in the war. And also was costly psychologically. It was apparently very difficult on those who were engaging in this killing. And so more efficient means were devised. One of them was the gas trucks, which basically were trucks where people were hustled into the back of the truck, and they pumped carbon monoxide into the back and killed dozens of people, or attempted to. It wasn't very effective. Carbon monoxide is not very effective or efficient as a way of killing people. People would just be sick and, half alive, and it just didn't work very well. So as the war went on, more efficient means of killing was necessary. In 1942, a conference at a chalet south of Berlin at Wannsee took place with Nazi leadership, and this group of individuals over lunch basically devised what has become known as the final solution, the project of eliminating the Jewish population of Europe. This involves liquidating the ghettos, collecting the Jewish people from where they had been concentrated in these ghettos and these communities that were attached to cities, and moving them to brutal labor camps. And you see Wiesel's experience in a number of them in the text, including Auschwitz and Birkenau and Buna. And the idea there is really to use them as labor, but also kind of to work them to death, to extract as much as possible out of them as laborers, and then the hope was that ultimately they would die. But as part of the final solution, some of the camps were simply death factories. So people were just dropped off there, and some of them even had facades that made them look like camps where things were actually happening, but it was all fake. The people went straight to the crematoria, or they went straight to the gas chambers, and then they were burned in the crematoria. Tens of thousands of people daily could be killed in these places, and this is really where most of the people in the Holocaust died during this later stage of the war. As the Nazis started to lose and the fronts started to close in on Germany itself, the death camps were destroyed to cover over the evidence. The labor camps were dispersed. Death marches were made into Germany. They were simply designed to kill as many people as possible. They weren't going anywhere, these death marches. And you see a very clear example of that, unfortunately, in the latter pages of Night, with young Ellie and his father being driven on one of these horrible, horrible marches. In the end, we are talking about a population that is completely decimated in Europe, 6 million Jewish people. It should be noted that 5 million others were targeted and killed by Nazis as part of their ideology. Obviously, tens of millions of people died as victims in the war itself, but others were targeted by the Nazis. But Jews were very much at the center of Nazi ideology as their target. I just include here some questions that will maybe help you think about some of the key themes as you read Elie Wiesel's Night, and the excellent companion story, namely The Shawl by Cynthia Ozick. And that story gives us a nice kind of counterbalance in thinking about children in the war and children as victims of the Holocaust, but also thinking about the intersectionality of gender. And Cynthia Ozick's short story, very powerful short story, offers us a different perspective where we have a father and a son. In Elie Wiesel's book, in The Shawl, we are really focused on mother and daughter relationship, and female relationships in general. So I will leave it at that. This is obviously very difficult material, challenging material to tackle, and yet it's just an extraordinarily powerful story. Some of you might have read Night before, but if you haven't, it is it's a very tough read, but ultimately, I think an extremely profound and an important read for everyone. So I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to your responses to these issues in this unit of the course.